Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 5th chapter in the book of Daniel. Daniel, along with Ezekiel, are the two major prophets from the exile period. So even while Judah was displaced from the land of promise and found themselves in captivity in Babylon, the torch of prophecy was not extinguished. It was kept alive by these two men. And Ezekiel came in the wave of 597 BM before Messiah. Daniel came a little later, around 586. That's when the city of Jerusalem and the temple was destroyed, and everyone that was left who wasn't carried in the first wave, which came some 13 years earlier, were taken with them, and there he rose to influence. He was of royal, if not royal, he was certainly of noble blood, and he impressed the king's underlings, King Nebuchadnezzar's underlings, and so much so he finally earned the good graces and was exalted into a position of preeminence by Nebuchadnezzar when he was troubled by a dream which he couldn't even remember. And Daniel not only recalled it from a blank slate, but gave the interpretation thereof. That was something none of his wise men or astrologers in his employ could do. And because of that, he was exalted to a position which would have been the functional equivalent of the prime minister. And in the 5th chapter, we read of Belteshazzar. He is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, and this is the fall of Babylon, of which we read. So after this chapter, the narrative transitions to Daniel's service. He served in a similar capacity as he had served Nebuchadnezzar to the Persian Emperor Cyrus, but Babylon would have been their main imperial rival. So this is the chapter where that battle is settled for all intents and purpose. So the opening verse reads, Belteshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his great men, and drank wine in the presence of the thousands. This was typical behavior of royalty to entertain lavishly, but the time was not appropriate because the Persians were literally at their gates. Now, the Babylonians had highly fortified cities. They had a complex series of walls, some of them as high as 300 feet tall. So he wasn't worried he thought it was a good idea to throw a party when serious attention was needed to the defense of his city. While tasting the wine, Belteshazzar gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his great men and his wives and his concubines could drink from them. So in the 2nd verse of the 1st chapter, we read that Nebuchadnezzar had pilfered the sacred vessels from the temple of Solomon, which he destroyed, but he also took with it the valuable items in them. But he had never, his grandson, Belteshazzar, had took it upon himself to treat the sacred things in a profane manner, to use it in a spirit of revelry, while we read in the 4th verse that they were praising their idols of wood, stone, and silver. So this was an egregious act of arrogance because his grandfather had a testimony of the God of Daniel, which he gave as eloquent as any Jew ever uttered, but somewhere along the line that knowledge was lost or forsaken. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of Elah, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his great men, his wives, and his concubines drank out of them. They drank wine and praised the mighty ones of gold and of silver, of bronze, of iron, of wood, and of stone. So these idols were as lifeless as the physical materials of which they were crafted. This is the emptiness and the folly of idolatry. It crafts images according to nature or human likenesses, whereas the reverse is in the true religion. Man is made in the image of God. In idolatry, that order is reversed, and they were idolaters. Now, I think Nebuchadnezzar, somewhere in 329, orders that the gods of Daniel and his three companions be praised, and yet he was not praising them, he was praising the traditional gods of the Babylonian people. At that moment, the finger of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. So in the midst of all their revelry, all their excitement, all their fun, all their partying, it is abruptly and inexplicably interrupted by a mysterious hand which is appearing out of nowhere to write a message to them. And we're going to read of that message, but so far all we've read of is the fact that they saw the hand and he had not yet written what he came to write. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened, and his knees knocked against each other. So he was nervous, as indicated by his physical reaction. There was mental trouble in his heart and mind, which was propelling and motivating the physical things we just read about, but it must have been embarrassing and humiliating for a king in the company of all his nobles, all the important men of his kingdom, to be at a loss of control. The king called loudly to bring in the astrologers, the castites, and the diviners. The king spoke of and said to the wise ones of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation is robed in purple and has a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." So we once more, as his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar, he was troubled by a dream he couldn't even remember. He has a similar reaction. He summons all the wise men, all the astrologers, all the purveyors of esoteric spiritual practices to come and fill his gap of comprehension, tell him what it all means, and he gives a promise that whoever can will be exalted to the third highest ranking station in his kingdom and be adorned with luxurious clothes and an item of gold around their neck. So all the king's wise ones came, but they were unable to read the writing or to make known its interpretation to the king. So once more, their inferior knowledge, they were inferior in the spiritual craft to Daniel, who was an advocate and proponent of the true religion. They were unable to understand, they were unable to see, they were unable to make sense of that which they could not read. Then King Belteshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his great men were puzzled. So once more, he has a physically adverse reaction to that which is perplexing him, and the spirit of confusion spreads all across the room. His great men, those would have been those in attendance at this banquet, which a serious buzzkill, to say the least, came in when they did not expect it. The queen, because of the words of the king and his great men, came to the banquet hall, and the queen spoke and said, "O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you, nor let your color change." Now, in most translations, this is the queen mother, which would have been the mother of the king, but for whatever reason here, it's queen. But the identity of the messenger does not alter or in any way reshape the nature or contents of the message. She's assuring him that, as we read, she knows of Daniel, because she would have been older than him, so it makes more sense that it was the queen mother. She would have had more exposure to Daniel, who had served his royal predecessor. "There is a man in your kingdom in whom the spirit of the sacred Elah, and in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the mighty ones, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, castites, and diviners." So whatever reason, Daniel would be demoted after the death of Nebuchadnezzar, and I think Belteshazzar may have succeeded him immediately. He was his grandson, so father in this term just means progenitor or or male ancestor. And she's praising Daniel, who had intuition, insight, illumination, and all of the above. There was no puzzle he could not piece together or mystery he could not figure out. And she's assuring him that he is at his disposal, and she will summon him for him to calm and quiet his dilemma. Because an excellent spirit, knowledge and understanding, interpreting dreams and explaining riddles and solving difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and let him show the interpretation. So the previously unidentified man of wisdom and understanding and knowledge is identified by name as Daniel, and he was renamed by Nebuchadnezzar to a more suitably Babylonian name, to Belteshazzar, which is similar but not exactly the same as Belteshazzar, the current king. And so she's encouraging him to summon him, and he'll give him the answer that no one else is able to provide him at this moment in time. So Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel who is the one of the sons of the exile from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard of you, that the spirit of Elah is in you, and that light and understanding and your excellent wisdom are found in you." So he's asking him who he is, where he came from, how he got here, and is it true the rumors he is hearing at literally the last day of his kingship. There's no reason he couldn't have or shouldn't have utilized his services while he was in his midst, but for whatever reason he didn't, and now he really needs him. He has nowhere else to turn, and that's that. "And the wise ones, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they were unable to show the interpretation of the word." So he's explaining to him that the writing of the wall had not been deciphered by all the so-called wise men that he had at his disposal. This was something only an extraordinarily insightful man, and his insight and foresight came from above. It was nothing within him, although it was above him, and the Spirit dwelled within him. So I actually misspoke. "And I myself have heard of you, that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. Now if you are able to read the writing and make known its interpretation to me, you are to be robed in purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." So he repeats the promise that he had earlier made in the 7th verse, in the company where Daniel was not yet present. He makes it known to him that he will exalt him and enrich him if he can if his reputation comes through to the test and passes it, and clarifies this mystery which was haunting him. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Yet I shall read the writing to the king, and make known the interpretation to him." So Daniel knew that the Babylonians the city of Babylon was surrounded by the Persians, who were literally at their gates, at their door. So whatever reward or riches he could bestow upon him, even if he wanted them, which even if he was a younger man, he probably would have graciously declined, would have been of no use or no avail, because his kingdom, as we soon read, his days are numbered. He's finished. That's going to be it. There's going to be nothing left for him to live for, not even life itself after this. "O king, the Most High Elah gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom and greatness, and esteem and honor." So even those who acknowledge him not, the secular rulers, are placed in their positions of authority by his providence and through his grace. This is true of even unsavory creatures such as Nebuchadnezzar and many, many others. Human history has no shortage of despicable tyrants. but they are there nevertheless for perhaps a wiser purpose than that which we can immediately intuit. And because of the greatness which he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wanted, he executed, and whomever he wanted to be kept alive, and whomever he wanted to be raised up, and whomever he wanted to, he made low. So in other words, the power of life and death, exaltation or degradation was solely in his hands. He was an absolute monarch whose word was the equivalent of the law. So anything he said, if this person he wanted executed or spared or promoted or demoted, it was never more than a word away. And because of the grace that had been given to him, he was unworthy of the grace, but in spite of that, he was a force to be reckoned with on the geopolitical stage. He was probably the most powerful man, if not in the world at that moment in time, certainly in his proximate territory, and so much so that all peoples, all nations, and language trembled and feared before him. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was so strong as to act proudly, he was put down from his throne of king, and they took his esteem from him. Now there's actually a medical condition which describes the condition which Nebuchadnezzar found himself in the 4th chapter. He thought he was a beast and acted indistinct from a beast. He could not, something possibly quite similar to transgenderism, where people think they are a gender they are not. He thought he was a species that he was not. And so he was enchained, and he had been given a grace period of a year to repent. And when he finally did, he was humbled and realized that everything he had accomplished, to go from the most powerful man in his world to as degraded and lowly as a beast of the field, would have sufficiently humiliated him, and humiliation can lead to humility, and henceforth he is mindful of the God of Daniel, whom he orders to be praised, and gives an expression, a testimony, an expression as eloquent as any Jew ever uttered. Then he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of the heavens, till he knew that the Most High Allah is ruler in the kingdom of men, and he appoints over it whom he wants. So in his beast-like condition, he was actually in the field. He was eating grass, just like an ox, and he was rained upon, much like a farm animal would be without protection of shelter. But through this degraded humiliation, he came to an understanding and an awareness that he had been put in his place by the sovereign and omnipotent one, who was the God of Daniel, whom he knew not, but henceforth he knew him and gave testimony and witness to him after being delivered from his wretched and degraded condition. And you, his son, Belteshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. There was no reason for him not to know this. The witness would have been recent, so he ordered a proclamation throughout his kingdom that all the peoples and all the nations and all the tongues praise and recognize and exalt the God of Daniel, yet it somehow slipped to his grandson and successor, who was not humbled by any of the... He came, even as we read, he came to understand the truth, but not submit to it. So he was not a humble man. There was no turning back from him at this point. There would be no 1-year grace period. This was the final act. He had committed an unpardonable sin by treating the sacred vessels of Solomon's temple in a profane manner. And you have lifted yourself up against the master of the heavens, and they brought before you the vessels of his house, and you and your great men, your wives and your concubines, have been drinking wine from them. And you have praised the mighty ones of silver, and of gold, and of bronze, of iron, of wood, and in stone, which neither see, nor hear, nor know. But the Ella who holds your breath in his hands, and owns all your ways, you have not made great. Daniel was not mincing words at this point. He spoke frankly and bluntly to the king. He told this is a laundry list of sins if we break them down. He was guilty of idolatry, he was guilty of blasphemy, he was guilty of pride, and many, many other sins. So because all of this, he did not, he chose to worship the idols of Babylon as opposed to the true and living Elohim, through whose grace he had been inherited the throne and risen to power, but he would not leave one to pass on to his descendants. The Chaldean Babylonian Empire would henceforth be no more. This was literally its last night. Then the part of the hand was sent from him, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed: Mene, Mene, Tekel, a parson. These are terms native to the Aramaic tongue, which by the Common Era was the what secular historians deem the Common Era was the colloquial tongue of the Jewish people. Hebrew still survived and was preserved, but it was not the tongue you would hear on the street. This is the interpretation of each word. Mene, Ella has numbered your reign and put an end to it. So his days were finished, they were numbered, he had exhausted his period of grace. There would be no period of grace after this time. There was nothing he could do to redeem himself at this moment in time except embrace the inevitable defeat and destruction and death. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found lacking. So this reminds us of the concept of Islam, where one's eternal salvation is determined by their good deeds, and their bad deeds will be weighed on a scale, and whichever one triumphs will determine their eternal fate and destiny. And because he was not a moral man, he had nothing to show for, and his moral character was lacking, and it was too late to even refine or repent his character. Peres, your reign has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So there would be no more Chaldean Babylonian Empire. They would soon be displaced and replaced by a force to their east, the Medo-Persians, which corresponds to the modern country of Iran, and they would be the dominant imperial hegemon before being replaced and displaced by the Greeks, who in turn would be displaced and replaced by the Romans. And this progression, the Babylonian, the Persian, the Medo-Persian, the Grecian, and the Roman, forms the foundation of the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, which Daniel interpreted, which describe in the second chapter, which describes a progression of worldly dominant powers to come after him, and things of that. So he was a far-sighted man. He had insight for the immediate situation such as this, and was also blessed with the gift of foresight and far-sightedness. Then Belteshazzar gave orders, and they robed Daniel in purple and put a chain of gold around his neck, and they proclaimed concerning him that he is the third ruler and the king. So even after this message, he could comprehend the truth but not submit to it. He remained stuck on his own stubborn ways. He was determined to do what he declared earlier, to exalt and enrich the man who had so interpreted the dream for him. Now he recognized that his interpretation was true, but he failed to heed its application before, then, or after. There wouldn't be much time after. In that night, Belteshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, so that from going to a wild party of revelry, he thought he was secure in his heavily fortified cities, but that very night he would die. That would be his last breath of life, and he did not end well, and he did not begin well, so we can accurately imagine that he is in hell as we speak. And Darius the Madite took over the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Now, this Darius ought not be confused with Cyrus's grandson and successor, Darius, who was instrumental in the restoration of the temple at Jerusalem, but this would have been a lieutenant of Cyrus's, who was the original Persian Empire, who was of Median stock, and he was 62 years old. So henceforth, after this, through the 6th through the 12th chapters, describes Daniel's experience and interactions with the new foreign power he was to placate and influence and serve while serving God. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. Bye-bye.